Imagine you're walking down the street with your friend when all of a sudden a police officer pulls you over. He thinks you've done something wrong, but you know you haven't. He asks you to put your hands up, and you do. Then all of a sudden, bang, and another bang. And it doesn't stop until after 6 more shots. Scary, isn't it? For some of you, it's hard to imagine why a cop would shoot someone 6 times with no good reason. Unfortunately, for many cops, the person's race is enough to treat them unfairly. On Saturday, August 9th, 2014, at 12:01 p.m., a situation just like that took place when Michael Brown was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson. When the case was brought before a grand jury, they chose not to indict Officer Wilson, despite the evidence that was present. This case sparked protests across the country, spreading the word that Black Lives Matter. While the grand jury for the Michael Brown case was a typical 12-person jury, with 9 jurors needed to make a decision, it functioned a bit differently than normal grand jury would. Normally, the prosecutor would give the grand jury a specific charge to consider, but in this case, none were given. As a result, many different charges were considered, from first-degree murder to unlawful discharge of a firearm. Unlike a regular court case, where it must be proven that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, a grand jury must prove that there is a probable cause to believe a crime was committed. What is incomprehensible is how this grand jury was able to pass on indicting Officer Wilson despite great evidence of probable cause, including Wilson's seeming lack of injury, eyewitness accounts that contradict Officer Wilson's testimony, and other forensic evidence. Since Wilson was not indicted, there will be no criminal trial, and no one will be held criminally responsible for Michael Brown's death. Beyond the evidence presented or ignored, the underlying problem of racism was pervasive throughout this case, starting with the collection of evidence that was mishandled during the initial investigation on the scene, to the lack of proper racial representation on the jury. It seems clear that bringing a criminal case against Officer Wilson would be almost impossible from the start. Despite Ferguson's large population of Black citizens, only 3 were selected for the grand jury, while the remaining 9 were white. Shouldn't a town with over 60% of its population being Black have more than 3 Black jurors on a grand jury? Ferguson has a history of racism, as it is in the same county as the 9th most segregated metro area in America in 2010, which was St. Louis. Ferguson is over 60% Black, but only 3 of its 53 police officers are Black. Only 1 city council member is Black, and the police chief and mayor are white. This lack of diversity in leadership, despite Ferguson's diverse population, can lead to a culture of racism as demonstrated in political statistics. One would expect that arrest statistics would mirror the population makeup. However, in Ferguson during 2013, Black citizens were 34% more likely to be arrested than whites. In that same year, 92% of searches and 86% of car stops involved Black citizens, even though they only represented 60% of the population. 284 days ago, the day the shooting occurred, Michael Brown was walking down the street with his friend Dorian Johnson when they were stopped by Officer Wilson. Diana Ermoselle from the Root writes, during the interviews with reporters, Johnson recounted the chilling confrontation. He said that a police car pulled up alongside Brown and him, and the officer, who has been identified as Officer Wilson since the incident, allegedly told Johnson and Brown to get the F off the sidewalk, or on the sidewalk. The 2 men told the officer that they were only minutes away from their destination. Johnson said that Wilson backed up his car and asked Brown and Johnson what they just said. Johnson claimed that Wilson then tried to open his car door. The door ricocheted off of Brown's body and closed again. Johnson said that Wilson pulled Brown through the car window by his neck, and Brown began to try to pull away. Johnson said that Wilson shot Brown during the scuffle, and Brown managed to break away from Wilson's grip. Brown and Johnson then began to run away from the police vehicle. Johnson said that Wilson got out of the car and began to shoot at Brown while Brown was running away. Brown then stopped, put his hands in the air, turned around, and pleaded with the officer to stop shooting since he didn't have a gun. Johnson said that Wilson continued to fire several more shots before Brown's body fell to the ground. This version of events is backed up by numerous eyewitnesses, although in contrast, Officer Wilson's version of events say, on a hot August day, Officer Wilson drove down a street and spotted two young black men walking down the middle of the road. One wore a black shirt, the other had cigarettes. Details of a robbery earlier that day blared out on a police radio, clicked into Wilson's head. Were they suspects? He told the two young men, one of whom was Brown, to move to the sidewalk. Things then happened very quickly. Wilson said Brown was at his car window, enraged. Wilson said Brown hit him in the face, grabbing for his gun. 2 shots fired. Brown bolted down the street. Wilson pursued. As Wilson told it, Brown charged the officer, reaching into his pants. Officer Wilson raised his .40 caliber SIG Sauer and aimed for a lethal shot. All I see is his head, and that's what I shot, Wilson recalled during a September 16th grand jury session in St. Louis. According to USA Today, it is a myth that Darren Wilson stopped Brown because he thought he was a suspect in a robbery. He stopped Brown and Johnson for walking in the middle of the street, according to Police Chief Tom Jackson. Even if Brown was a suspect in the robbery, did he need to be shot 6 times? According to Officer Wilson, he had reason to shoot Michael Brown at least 6 times because he was charging at him and looking like a demon. He says this by literally demonizing an 18-year-old, but he has next to none injuries that support his story. The photos taken of him after the incident, if looked at by someone with no background information, look like nothing was wrong with him. A police officer with barely any injuries walks out of the shooting alive and well, while an unarmed black 18-year-old with his whole life ahead of him gets shot 6 times. Does this seem wrong? Officer Wilson could have also elected to use non-lethal weapons, like mace or a taser, but decided against it. He wasn't even carrying a taser because it is not the most comfortable thing in the world, he said. They are very large. I don't have a lot of room in the front for it to be positioned. This man's comfort could have been exchanged for Michael Brown's life if he had used non-lethal weapons. It is more than just Michael Brown. It's how a community needs to address the racial issues present in its leadership. Let us remember Michael Brown and peacefully work to fix the inequalities present in the police and criminal justice system. Don't forget Michael Brown. Don't forget what happened in Ferguson. Don't forget that Black Lives Matter. Don't forget how the media tried to justify Michael Brown's murder. Don't forget Michael Brown and the countless others killed in situations just like his.